Let us pray. Father, thank you for your word and its truth, its power, its strength, its insight, its wisdom, its comfort, its guidance. Help us to understand your word more fully and completely today. Help us to grow in our faith as a result, and may we be more fit for your kingdom as we understand and are transformed more and more by your truth. Now may my words be your words as we seek to learn and grow together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We are beginning a series of messages for the summer on the book of Daniel. We're going to preach through the book of Daniel for the rest of the summer, and we thought that I thought it would be a good topic for us. It's very timely. It's also a very interesting book if you don't know that much about the book of Daniel. It's an amazing book that's part history, but also part prophecy. Daniel is considered the last of the category of major prophets in the Old Testament, and it contains both prophecy that's been fulfilled in history since his time to now, and also yet to be fulfilled prophecy for the future. It's often thought to be the Old Testament companion to the book of Revelation, and we'll get into that when we start talking about some of those prophecies. But Daniel's story as a person is an amazing one of God's protection, guidance, and the unfolding history of God's plan that he was a part of. This takes place about 600 years before Christ. And so that's about 2,600 years ago. During this time, it was a few centuries of Israel being in decline because they had problems with sin, with idolatry, with immorality. And God eventually judged them for refusing to live by the rules he set for them. Now remember, the nation of Israel had been originally comprised of 12 separate tribes based on the 12 sons of Jacob. But about 100 years before the time of Daniel, the 10 northernmost tribes, I'm talking geographically now, were destroyed by the Assyrians. The southern 2 remaining tribes, Benjamin and Judah, would have probably also been destroyed, but on Judah's throne, because at this time the kingdom had split into 2 parts, so there were 2 kings and so on Judah's throne was good King Hezekiah. And God saved the southern kingdom because of Hezekiah's faith and trust in God, and so they avoided that destruction by the Assyrians. But about 25 years before the events of the book of Daniel, the Babylonians conquered the Assyrian Empire, and they became an empire unto themselves. Now, originally that wasn't a problem. On Judah's throne was good King Josiah. He would have probably been the king when Daniel was a boy, a younger boy. But by the time of the events of the book of Daniel, he was replaced by an evil king by the name of Jehoiakim. And God judged the southern kingdom as well to say, you're just too far gone. You're doing evil. We need to have punishment. A lot of that you can read in the book of Jeremiah because he lived during this time as well. God used the Babylonians and King Nebuchadnezzar as his instrument of judgment for his people. And what happened is the Babylonians invaded the southern kingdom. And over the course of about 20 or so years, there were 3 successive invasions by the Babylonians where they conquered much of the southern kingdom and took away many hostages, many captives. 3 separate times captives were taken back to Babylon to become slaves. See, the Babylonians weren't stupid. They realized if we want to have a big empire and don't want to have to do all the work ourselves, we'll just use our captives to do the work for us that we don't want to do. And unfortunately, slavery was the rule in the ancient world for many, many centuries. And that's what was happening here. We believe that Daniel was taken to Babylon during the first of these three invasions, around 605 BC. He was a young man, we're told. And we'll get into that as we walk through the scriptures. So he was probably, 16 to 20, 25. I don't know exactly what age range you're talking, but he was considered a young man. Not a child anymore, not an older, fully mature adult. Usually in the Jewish culture that meant over 30. But he was a young man during this time when he was taken. His life would be changed forever, and we're going to talk about that briefly. And yet God would use him to save the nation of Israel. Believe it or not. That's why the series I'm calling For Such a Time as This. Because he was God's man at the right time, used in a way that he would never have thought possible. So we're going to pick up the story, Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, what happened at this point is Jerusalem is surrounded by the Babylonian armies. This wasn't the first time this happened. 100 years before, the Assyrians tried the same thing, and God sent the angel of death to slaughter thousands of them to protect Jerusalem. This time there was no protection. So the people were locked inside the city. They couldn't get out. The walls protected them from the Babylonians for a while. But eventually, the city would fall. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, when this first started, wasn't king. His father, Nabopolassar, I think was his name, was king, and Nebuchadnezzar was his main military leader. But sometime during this period, Nebuchadnezzar ascends to the throne, and so he is finishing up the military campaign, and then he's got to go back to Babylon and sit on the throne and rule the vast empire. In fact, if you want to take a quick look here on the map, this was the Babylonian Empire. Here is Egypt and northeast Africa, the Sinai Peninsula. Here's where Israel is. There's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. There's the Mediterranean. There's the Persian Gulf. Right here is where Kuwait is today. Saudi Arabia. Over here is where Iran is today. The region here is where Iraq is today. That's where the Babylonian Empire was. But as you can see, it covered an area all the way up here into southern Turkey and came down the Persian Gulf, came all the way over to the east coast of the Red Sea. It was a massive empire. That's the kind of power and wealth that the Babylonians had. So a tiny little country like Judah was not going to be able to stop them when they wanted to take whatever they wanted to take, is what I'm saying. So, especially when God's divine protection was no longer on Judah because of their sinfulness. We go on. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Now again, this is during the first invasion. By the third invasion, 586, the Babylonians just decide, well, we've taken enough stuff out of here, let's just destroy the temple, we'll destroy the city, tear down the walls of Jerusalem, and everything was just a complete ruin. At that point in time, most of the smarter, healthier, wealthier people from Judah were already taken away as captives. The only people left were kind of the peasants, the people that Babylon was not afraid of. And at this point in time, it looked like the Jewish nation would fade into history and no longer exist. But that wasn't God's plan, as we're going to see. But at this point in this early invasion, he takes some of the vessels from the house of God, the golden chalices and plates and things like that. That's mentioned here because it's going to come into play later on in the book of Daniel, so I won't spoil the surprise, but I'm just telling you that's why it's mentioned here. This begins the period of what is known as the Babylonian captivity. 70 years, the people who were taken from Judah to Babylon would live in Babylonia until eventually they could return. And that's another story for later in the book. But that's what was happening. Now, he goes on in the telling here where he says, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles." So those who were primed to be taken as captives were the younger, more educated, more well-to-do Israelites. So the king orders his chief servant to bring some of them before him. Now Nebuchadnezzar was no fool. He realized that the best way to stay in power was to integrate members of nations that he had conquered. If you just slaughter everybody, what are you going to end up with? But if those who were willing to serve you could enhance your own power and influence. And that's what he's doing here. He's specific about who they are, though. Youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. So he's looking for basically, for lack of a better word, guys who were college-age, smart, and successful in their community. You know, the people who would have eventually become the leaders in Judah as they got older. Nebuchadnezzar wants to tap into their gifts and their intelligence and their strength to enhance his own power. They're still going to be his servants, his slaves, but they won't have to, be out there making mud bricks with straw like the Israelites in Egypt had to under Pharaoh. They're going to have a relatively good life even though they're under the control of a pagan foreign king. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So they needed to be educated in the learning of the Babylonian Empire so they could be more effective. They had to learn the language, obviously, if there was a language barrier they couldn't speak. And also they needed to learn the history and the writings and the laws and so on if they were going to serve the king. So that was what their life was going to be if they were considered worthy. And there was a whole process that this was going to take that Daniel becomes a part of. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank. So they were given good food and drink. They weren't treated like the average slave. It wasn't a bread and water diet, you know what I mean? They weren't going to be starved to death. They were going to enjoy the level and quality of food that the king himself had. He was making an investment in these young men that he thought would pay off for his power and the furtherance of the Babylonian Empire. And appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. So we know that it's going to be at least 3 more years in Daniel's life. What's ahead for him? Assuming he's considered worthy. It was an extensive period of education. It wasn't a crash course. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to make sure that they were thoroughly up on what they needed to know if they were going to be his servants. Now we get more details. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those names sound a little strange to you, don't they? But those were their Hebrew names, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. These young men are going to be central to the story for the first part of the book. The commander of the officials assigned new names to them. And to Daniel he assigned the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. You've heard of those names, huh? Well, what's going on here? Why'd you give somebody new names, you know? What is it because they needed to sound more Babylonian? There's much more at work here, though. Let's take a look. Look at the names' meanings here, versus their original Hebrew names and then the new Babylonian names they were given. First of all, Daniel means God is judge. Dan-el. But his name gets changed to Belteshazzar, which means may Bel protect his life. Bel was a Babylonian god. And what we're going to see through this is they made sure they deleted any reference to the Jewish God and identified these men as servants of their pagan gods. That was the main reason for the name change. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious, gets his name changed to Shadrach, command of Aku, another Babylonian god. Mishael, who is what God is, to Meshach, who is what Aku is, again, Babylonian god. And Azariah, whom Yahweh helps, gets changed to Abednego, servant of Nebo, another Babylonian god. So they're completely trying to destroy their original identity to make them fit in. Excuse me. Fit in their new culture. Now, when we read through the book of Daniel and the way we learned it, for whatever reason, we keep Daniel's Hebrew name, but we use the Babylonian names for the other three. You know, who's ever heard of Mishael or Azariah? I mean, unless you really have studied it. But you know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? But those were their pagan names. Those weren't their Hebrew names. So, and we'll get into that with them. They're going to come into the story a little later, of course. Now a problem happens. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. What's the matter? Is there something wrong with the food? Was it unclean? Jews were allowed to drink wine. What's the issue? Well, first of all, there may have been some unclean foods in the cuisine that they were given. So good Jews wouldn't eat unclean foods. They wouldn't eat pork. They wouldn't eat certain shellfish, etc. So if some of that was in the food they were given, they couldn't really eat it without feeling like they were sinning against God. But there's an even more important component to this. In the ancient world, everything was about religion. And what would happen, I'm sure, for the king's food and the king's wine, before it came to him, it would be taken to the pagan temples to be prayed over so that it would be blessed by the pagan gods. We run into that problem in the New Testament. Paul talks about meat sacrificed to idols in places like Corinth and Rome. Same issue. By eating the meat, you were accepting the blessing from the pagan god. By drinking the wine, you were accepting the blessing from the pagan god. That was committing idolatry. So Daniel realizes this, even as a young man. He's obviously serious and devout in his faith. He says, look, I can't do this. He's respectful about it. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. He went to, I guess, Ashpenaz and says, look, we want to do what we can here to be good servants. We want to learn everything you want to teach us. We know this is where God has us, but we just can't take this next step and start worshiping your gods and ignoring our own. It's not who we are. Now, he was a slave, so you would think, well, the commander would just say, well, all right, put him to death, we'll find 4 other guys that we can get to do this. But God intervenes. Now, God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. God was at work behind the scenes because he has a plan for Daniel and his friends. He was not going to let this destroy his future. Nor was he wanting Daniel to commit sin to somehow serve God. So there's a workaround. But it takes some time. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? In other words, if you don't eat the good food, you're not going to look good. You're going to look gaunt, perhaps. You're going to lose weight. You're going to look pale. I'm supposed to fatten you up so you look healthy. So what am I going to do here, Daniel, Belteshazzar? How can I do this? And oh, by the way, if I let you do this and you look haggard, then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. So he knew he couldn't cross Nebuchadnezzar. If this didn't go according to plan, Nebuchadnezzar would hold him accountable for it, and he would be replaced very quickly, permanently, by Nebuchadnezzar. When you're the ruler of the known world, you don't have to make excuses. You just do what you want, unfortunately. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, still giving their Hebrew names, he gives a proposal to them. Please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Well, there was no special blessing prayed over water. And why would you take vegetables into a temple to ask for prayers of blessing over carrots and leeks and potatoes? And, they wouldn't do that. So Daniel's thinking, this food is neutral, the water is neutral, it's safe for us to eat and drink. We can do this. We can survive, and yet we won't be breaking God's law. Now, some people think, well, this was actually the right thing to do because the nutritional value of the vegetables was better than the choice meats and stuff that the king wanted to give. I don't buy that. I think even though the diet was substandard, God still blessed them to show that he was with them. Even if they had given them bread and water, they would still look healthy and robust because God was preparing them for what he had for them. It wasn't about the diet, it was about God honoring them for their faithfulness to him that kept them healthy. He goes on, he says, then let our appearance be observed in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food. So he says, for a period of time, we'll eat our diet, they can eat theirs, and at the end of the period of time, we'll see who looks better. Now again, Daniel's trusting God here. He's not a committed vegetarian. He just is trusting God. And then he says to him, compare us and deal with your servants according to what you see. Well, as the story goes on, of course, at the end of time, Daniel and his friends look healthy and robust, even healthier than the other guys, the other slaves or whatever that were there. And there may have been many other young men who were going through this process that weren't Jewish, because Nebuchadnezzar and his armies were conquering the whole Middle East. You saw that with the map. So there may have been people from many other nations that were part of this whole program. But God honors them for that. And that kind of gives an indication to Nebuchadnezzar's servant that maybe their God is at work in their lives. Not that they would have worshipped Yahweh, but maybe they had a little bit of respect, perhaps, for what was happening. And Nebuchadnezzar was the kind of guy, he wasn't going to burn any bridges he didn't have to burn. If there was some blessing and benefit to be had from this foreign god, he wanted it. He wasn't going to reject his own gods. But in the ancient world, when people were polytheistic, they could worship all kinds of gods as long as they worshiped their own too. See, that's where Israel was so different, being monotheistic, only worshiping the real God. They rejected all the others, and when they didn't and they tried to include others, that's where the trouble started. But in the other religions of the day, there was flexibility allowed. There was extra potential from other blessings from other gods or religions. So he must have seen from the very beginning, something's going on here with these guys. Maybe it will benefit me. Well, here we see the beginnings of a completely different life for Daniel and his friends. They were the elite in Judah before all this happened. They had not a care in the world. These weren't the guys who were out there behind the oxen plowing the fields. These weren't the guys who were out there, cutting the stones as masons. These were the people who were educated, who would have been the business leaders or perhaps even religious leaders in Judah had this not happened. Now suddenly they are slaves. Yet God still blessed them that they didn't totally have to have a horrible life. But they wouldn't be free. As Judah, God's people, wouldn't be free for 70 years. They were under the control of this dictator, Nebuchadnezzar. It must have taken Daniel great faith to thrive in these circumstances. He's looking at the death of his nation, possibly eventually the death of his people. So what does he do? He has to trust God that there's some greater plan at work here that he doesn't know anything about. And the key to this first section of the book, I think, is this phrase right here. Now God granted Daniel favor. God had chosen him for this. Certainly his friends too, in a lesser sense. But God had chosen him. And he didn't know all that was going to happen. He probably didn't understand the role that God had for him at the time. But he trusted in what he couldn't see. He trusted that somewhere God was going to turn what was a horrible, horrible situation for his people. I mean, many starved, many were killed in the siege, many were butchered in the battles. His whole nation was decimated. But he had to believe that God still had a plan and a purpose. As we'll see as we walk through this, God certainly did. He's someone, if he wasn't who God made him to be, there would be no Israel anymore. And therefore there would be no coming of Christ through Israel anymore, and the biblical prophecies being fulfilled, and so on. But Daniel trusted. Even in a foreign land with people who didn't like him probably, who didn't really have any respect for him, at least not much, he trusted that God was going to use him. He accepted God's plan for him. And you know, it would mean that Daniel would never ever see his homeland again. Daniel never returned to Israel, to Judah. He lived out his whole life to old age in Babylon. And he even goes beyond the Babylonians to the Persians, but that's later in the book. Imagine that, if God called us to do that. I'm going to take you out of everything you know, take you to a foreign nation where you're now a slave, you don't know the language, you don't know the customs, you don't know the religion, and you're never ever coming home again. I don't think there are too many of us that could bear up under those kind of circumstances. And yet, Daniel did. So he's an inspiration for us, and as we see how God uses him to do mighty things as we go through the book, our respect and admiration for him will only grow. He's somebody that we can learn lessons from, to show that even if life isn't always good, even if it doesn't go according to plan, if we trust the Lord, He will still use us, He will still guide us, He will still protect us. There are a few other times that God steps in to protect Daniel that we'll get to. But he is somebody that we can be inspired by in our faith. He never had ambitions to be a mighty prophet of God. We have no indication that he came from the school of the prophets or that he came from a prophetic or priestly family. And yet God still used him in this amazing way. And you can feel free to read ahead through the book if you want to. I mean, we're going to walk through it through the summer, but you can see some of the amazing ways that he is used by God to do impossible things. It's because he trusted in the Lord. He honored God, even in this little thing about what you're going to eat, because he knew the greater implications. And even though they tried to change his name to honor a pagan god, he still knew who he was. He never forgot that. So let's be inspired by Daniel. Let's look at his example and say, hey, if God could do that for him, what can he do for me? How can he help me in my circumstance? How can he be there to uplift me and uphold me when times are tough? None of us knows what the future may hold. I mean, we've gone a long time in this nation now without any major wars or major economic crashes. They've happened more than once in our past, and who knows what can happen in the future. If that does happen, are we going to be able to trust God, even though our comfort is totally ripped away from us? If we trust in the Lord, like Daniel did, we don't have to have any fear of anything, because God will be there for us. He will help us to overcome whatever may come. That's the kind of great love he has for us. So let's be inspired by Daniel's story as we walk through it this coming rest of the summer.